The wind came down from the Judith Mountains at 23 minutes past 9 on the night of January 23rd, 1884, carrying a sound that men who had survived Montana winters would later describe as something close to grief. It was not the howl of an ordinary blizzard. It was lower than that, deeper a vibration that lived in the bones of the earth itself, and it shook the timber framing of every structure within 40 miles of Lewistown until the nails strained against the wood, and the wood strained against the nails, and somewhere in the darkness, men and women and children who had built their cabins the way their fathers and grandfathers had built them began to understand that they were not going to live through what was coming. Astrid Bergstrom heard the knock on her door at exactly that minute. She had been sitting beside her cast-iron stove, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, and she had been listening to the wind, the way a sailor listens to a storm at sea, with the calm attention of someone who knows that fear changes nothing. The temperature outside had dropped to 38 degrees below zero. The temperature inside her quarters, 8 feet below the surface of the Montana prairie, had held steady at 61 degrees for the past 4 hours. The knock came again. 3 sharp blows, then silence, then a voice that was barely a voice anymore, the kind of voice that comes from a throat that has been breathing minus 38-degree air for too long. Astrid stood up. She set the tin cup on the wooden table her husband had built for her in another country, in another life, and she walked the 7 steps from her stove to her door, and she put her hand on the heavy oak latch, and she paused there for 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths. Now, before I tell you what she found on the other side of that door, I need you to understand something about Astrid Bergstrom. I need you to understand what she had buried 2 years before that night and why she had spent every waking hour of those 2 years digging into the side of a Montana hillside with a shovel and a pickaxe and a will that men 3 times her size had stopped trying to argue with. Because what happened in the next 6 days, what saved 5 lives in a storm that killed 38 other people across the territory, did not happen because Astrid was lucky. It happened because of what she had lost. Let me take you back. Minnesota, the winter of 1880. A small homestead on the edge of the big woods, 12 miles from the nearest town, 14 miles from the nearest doctor. The cabin was a good one by the standards of the time, 20 by 24 feet, hewn logs chinked with clay and horsehair, a stone chimney built by a man named Eric Bergstrom, who had learned masonry from his father in the village of Sundsvall, Sweden, before crossing the Atlantic in 1873 with $87 and a young wife named Astrid, and the kind of hope that only 23-year-old men who have never seen a Minnesota blizzard can carry in their chests. By 1880, that cabin held 3 people: Eric, 31 years old, a carpenter, and Millwright, who had built half the barns within a day's ride of his property. Astrid, 30 years old, who could read 3 languages and had taught herself to butcher a hog by watching a neighbor do it once. And Henrik, 4 years old, dark-haired like his father, with his mother's pale gray eyes, a boy who had learned to walk in the snow before he had learned to walk on grass, a boy who slept every night with a small wooden horse Eric had carved for him on his 2nd birthday. The night it happened was a Tuesday. The temperature had been falling all day. Eric had spent the afternoon in the woodshed splitting cordwood for a winter that was already turning out to be harder than the last 3 put together. Astrid had been in the small barn that stood 30 feet from the cabin because their milk cow had gone into labor that morning, and the calf was coming breech, and Astrid had her hands inside the animal turning the calf when the temperature outside the barn dropped to 32 degrees below zero. She did not come back to the cabin until almost midnight. The lantern in the barn had run out of oil. She walked the 30 feet through snow that came up to her knees, and she saw that the cabin had no smoke rising from its chimney, and she felt her heart go cold before her body did. The chimney had cracked, a hairline fracture in the stone no thicker than a strand of horsehair, but in a Minnesota winter at 32, below a hairline fracture is enough. The fire in the hearth had drawn cold air down the cracked flue, and the smoke had backed up into the cabin, and Eric had been asleep beside the hearth, with Henrik curled against his chest, the 2 of them sharing a single buffalo hide blanket because Astrid had taken the heavier wool one out to the barn. She found them like that. Eric with his arm wrapped around the boy, Henrik with his small fist closed around the wooden horse. Their faces were peaceful. The room was full of carbon monoxide and the kind of silence that lives forever in the memory of the person who walks into it. Astrid sat on the floor beside them for 36 hours. The cow finished her labor alone in the barn. The calf survived. Astrid did not move until a neighbor named Olaf Lindquist came on Thursday morning to borrow a saw and found her there and carried her out of the cabin in his arms because she had stopped being able to walk or speak or close her eyes. This is the woman who came to Montana in April of 1882. She arrived in Lewistown on a Tuesday afternoon on a stagecoach that had broken an axle twice between Helena and the Judith Basin, and she stepped down from that coach with one canvas bag and $73 in a small wooden box that she carried in both hands and would not let the driver touch. Inside the wooden box, wrapped in a piece of wool that had once been part of a baby's blanket, were two things. One was a child's leather shoe no bigger than a man's palm with a small brass buckle that Eric had hammered into shape on a winter evening in 1879. The other was a folded letter from her older sister Helga in Chicago, who had written from a brick row house in the Swedish quarter of the city, asking Astrid to come and live with her, to give up the homesteading dream, to come and work in a respectable household, where a woman of her education could find suitable employment and perhaps in time another husband. Astrid had read the letter twice. She had not answered it. She had used the back of the third page to make a list of supplies she would need for the journey west. The day Astrid Bergstrom registered her quarter section at the Lewistown land office was the same day the office opened for the season, and there was a line of 17 men ahead of her, and not one of them stepped aside to let her go first. She stood in that line for 4 hours and 12 minutes. When her turn came, the clerk looked up from his ledger and asked if she was registering on behalf of her husband, and she said no, and he asked if she was registering on behalf of her father, and she said no. And he sat there for a long moment with his pen above the page before he finally wrote her name in the column reserved for sole owners, and the man behind her in line made a sound through his teeth that was not quite a laugh and not quite anything else. That summer, she worked at the Holloway Ranch as a cook for the seasoned hands. The ranch belonged to a man named Thaddeus Holloway, a 50-year-old widower who had run cattle in the Judith Basin for 11 years and had buried 2 wives and a son in the small cemetery behind his main house. Thaddeus Holloway was not a sentimental man. He paid his hands fairly. He expected hard work, and he noticed things about people that other people did not notice. What he noticed about Astrid Bergstrom was this: she did not sleep in the bunkhouse with the other female workers. She did not sleep in the small room he had offered her at the rear of the kitchen. She slept in the barn on a pile of clean straw with one wool blanket in the wooden box she carried with her everywhere. He noticed this on her third night at the ranch when he went out to the barn at midnight to check on a sick mare, and he saw her there sleeping curled on her side with her hand on the box. He did not ask her about it. He walked back to the main house, and the next morning at breakfast, he set a heavier blanket on the kitchen counter without a word, and Astrid looked at the blanket, and she looked at him, and she nodded once, and that was the entire conversation. By October, Astrid had walked every acre of the quarter section she had registered. She had dug 6 test holes at 6 different points along the hillside that bordered the southern edge of her property. She had measured the angle of the morning sun in 3 different months. She had recorded the prevailing wind direction on 42 separate days using a piece of red ribbon tied to a stick driven into the ground. She had memorized the path of every game trail and the location of every spring within 2 miles of where she planned to build. She was preparing to begin construction when she walked into the First Bank of Lewistown on a Tuesday morning in early November to exchange the last of her American dollars for the silver coins she preferred to carry, and she met Cyrus Hardwick for the first time. Cyrus Hardwick was 50 years old. He was tall, 6 feet 2 inches, with a slightly stooped posture of a man who had spent 30 years bending over ledgers. His hair was iron gray, cut short and parted on the left side. He wore a black wool suit that had been tailored in St. Louis, and he carried a gold pocket watch on a chain that had belonged to his grandfather, who had been a Methodist minister in Pennsylvania before the war. He was the president of the First Bank of Lewistown, the largest depositor in the second largest bank in Helena, and a sitting member of the Federal Land Office Advisory Board for the Montana Territory. He was also, though no one in Lewistown knew it yet, a private investor in the proposed northern extension of the Northern Pacific Railroad, which was scheduled to begin survey work through the Judith Basin in the spring of 1887. He saw Astrid Bergstrom standing at the teller's window. He noticed the wooden box she set on the counter beside her purse. He noticed that her boots were worn through at the heels, but had been carefully polished. He noticed the way she counted the silver coins twice before she put them in her bag, not because she did not trust the teller, but because she had counted everything twice for 2 years and was not going to stop now. He walked over to her after the transaction was complete. He introduced himself. He smiled the way bankers smile at homesteaders, with the gentle condescension of a man who knows that 90% of them will fail within 5 years. He offered her a small business loan to assist with the construction of her cabin, a standard arrangement, $200 at 8% interest, repayable over 3 years against the value of the improvements she made to her land. Astrid declined. She did so politely. She did so without explaining why. Cyrus Hardwick's smile did not change, but something in his eyes did. He told her that he understood that he respected her independence and that she should remember the bank was always available if circumstances changed. He said this last sentence the way another man might say goodbye, and he tipped his hat to her, and he watched her walk out of the bank carrying her wooden box, and he stood at the window for a full minute after she was gone before he walked back to his office and sat down at his desk and wrote her name on a piece of paper. Now here is what no one in Lewistown knew about Cyrus Hardwick in November of 1882, and here is what Astrid would not learn for almost an entire year. Cyrus Hardwick had buried his wife 12 years before. Her name had also been Astrid. She had been 27 years old when she died in childbirth on a January night in 1870 in a fine brick house in Pittsburgh, and the child had survived. The child was a boy named Edward, and Edward was now 12 years old, and Edward lived in Helena with his grandmother because Cyrus Hardwick had decided in a way he did not let himself examine too closely that he could not look at the boy every day without seeing the woman whose death the boy had caused. What Cyrus Hardwick wanted more than money, more than the railroad investment, more than the seat on the Land Office Advisory Board, was to leave something to his son, a legacy, a name that meant something in the territory. He had calculated in his careful banker's way that the Northern Pacific extension could multiply the value of every quarter section along its eventual right-of-way by a factor of 40 within 10 years. He had begun quietly, methodically to acquire those quarter sections. He had 11 of them already. The piece of land Astrid Bergstrom had registered that April was the 12th he needed. He was not a valmetmet. He had never raised his hand against another human being in 50 years of life. He did not hire thugs. He did not burn barns. He did not poison wells or cut fences or send men in the night to break the legs of those who stood in his way. He used the slower instruments. He used loans called in at inconvenient times. He used quiet words spoken to the right merchants. He used the apparatus of the law itself, the Homestead Act, the Land Office, the technicalities of statute and definition. These were the weapons that men like Cyrus Hardwick had been using to clear the path of progress for 200 years, and they were more effective than any rifle. 3 days after Astrid declined his loan, Cyrus Hardwick met privately with the senior clerk of the Lewistown Land Office. He purchased that man a very good dinner at the Lewistown Hotel. He asked him a number of careful questions about the legal definition of a habitable dwelling under the Homestead Act of 1862. He listened to the answers. He paid for the dinner. He went home and wrote a second name on a second piece of paper, this one filed away in the locked drawer of his office desk for use at the appropriate time. Astrid Bergstrom began digging on the 7th of November, 1882. The hillside she had chosen ran along the southern edge of her property, sloping down toward Big Spring Creek at an angle of roughly 15 degrees. The bedrock she needed lay 17 feet below the grass at the highest point of the slope, and she had confirmed this by sinking a test hole through frozen ground over the course of 2 weeks in late September. She marked the corners of her excavation with stakes cut from lodgepole pine. She measured everything twice. She broke ground with a pickaxe and a spade and a wheelbarrow she had bought used from a farmer outside Fort Benton for $4 and a promise to mend his oldest daughter's wedding dress. She worked alone. She worked for 10 hours a day, in November 8 hours a day, in December 6 hours a day, in January when the temperature dropped below zero, and she could only swing the pick for 15 minutes at a time before her hands began to lose feeling. She built fires in the bottom of the excavation each morning to thaw the next layer of earth before she could dig it. She hauled the displaced soil up the slope in the wheelbarrow and dumped it on a long ridge to the north of the building site where it would later serve as a windbreak for her wheat fields. By the second week of February 1883, she had cut a level platform of exposed bedrock 12 feet wide and 24 feet deep into the side of the hill. The walls of the excavation rose 7 feet on 3 sides. The fourth side, the south side, opened to the sky. This was when Walter Croft came to look at her work for the first time. Walter Croft was 55 years old and had been building cabins in central Montana for the better part of 2 decades. He was a thin man, leathery with eyes the color of pale slate and a permanent squint from 20,000 hours of looking into the sun. He had built 17 homesteads between Fort Benton and Lewistown, and he had buried 3 of his own children, and he had a daughter named Mary who had died in a blizzard in 1875 at the age of 9 in a cabin Walter himself had built, and that he had believed at the time to be the best cabin in the territory. He did not talk about Mary. He had not spoken her name aloud to another human being in 8 years. He came to look at Astrid's excavation on a cold February morning, ostensibly because he was passing by on his way to deliver a load of milled timber to a homesteader 6 miles east. He stood at the edge of her excavation in 3 feet of snow, and he looked down into the hole she had cut, and he turned to her, and he spat tobacco juice into the snow, and he said, "You are burying yourself alive." Astrid did not answer right away. She watched the way the wind carved patterns in the snow across her property. She had been doing that for 4 months. She had memorized the patterns. She knew which drifts formed where and why. "The barn sits on top," she said finally in her Swedish accented English. "Living quarters go beneath, cut into the slope, 3 walls of earth, 1 wall of logs facing south." Walter Croft pulled his coat tighter against the wind. Behind him, a wagon creaked to a stop. The driver was a man named Friedrich Vogel, 63 years old, born in Bremen, who had built traditional log structures in the Dakota Territory for 20 years before moving west 2 years earlier with his wife Greta and their 17-year-old daughter Ingrid. Friedrich climbed down from the wagon slowly, the way men past 60 climb down from wagons in February cold, and he walked to the edge of the excavation and he looked down at what Astrid had done and he shook his head. "Fräulein," he said in his German accented English, "you understand what happens when earth shifts in the spring. When the snow melt comes, that hillside will move, and your whole structure goes with it." "The drainage goes east," Astrid said. "Bedrock 8 feet down slopes away from the structure. I am cutting in above the spring line." "You have hit bedrock?" Friedrich asked, surprised. "Last week, 17 feet in from the hill, face right where I need my back wall." Walter Croft walked closer. He studied the work she had begun. He saw the foundation logs she had positioned, lodgepole pine she had cut and stripped and dried through the autumn, notched with a precision that did not come from books. He saw the flat stones she had hauled from the creek bed, each one carefully leveled. He bent down and ran his fingers along one of the notches she had cut into a foundation log. The cut was clean. The angle was right. "The joists for the barn floor," Friedrich asked, "they run north and south, every 16 inches with cross bracing," Astrid said. The load transfers to the hillside into these foundation logs. Friedrich studied the work for several minutes. Astrid saw him doing the calculations in his head, testing her logic against 40 years of experience. He did not say anything for a long time. "It might work," he said finally, "but you are gambling your life on it." Astrid did not respond. She picked up her pick. She walked back down into the excavation. She began to swing. Walter Croft watched her work for another 10 minutes. Then he climbed back up onto the wagon beside Friedrich Vogel, and the two men drove away in silence, and neither of them spoke until they were 3 miles down the road, when Walter said, "She is going to die out here." And Friedrich said, "Perhaps," and they did not say anything else until they reached Lewistown. Astrid worked alone in that excavation through the rest of February and through March. She did not see another human being for stretches of 9 and 10 days at a time. She drank melted snow. She ate dried venison and hardtack and the last of the potatoes she had bought in November. She slept in a small canvas tent pitched on the lee side of the rising barn frame with a single iron stove she fed 3 times a night to keep the canvas from freezing solid. Every night before she slept, she opened the wooden box. She took out the small leather shoe with the brass buckle. She set it beside the stove on a flat stone she had brought specifically for this purpose, so the shoe would be warm when she went to sleep. She did not pray. She did not weep. She lay on her side with her hand on the box, and she listened to the wind, and sometimes she imagined that she could hear very faintly the sound of a 4-year-old boy laughing somewhere just out of reach, and she did not let herself follow the sound, because she had learned in 3 years of survival that following that sound was the thing that would kill her. In the second week of March, Bear came into her life. Thaddeus Holloway rode out to her property on a Sunday afternoon leading a second horse that carried a large wooden crate. Inside the crate was a Pyrenean mountain dog, 2 years old, white and gray, weighing 130 pounds, with the calm, watchful eyes of a breed that had guarded sheep in the Pyrenees Mountains for 1,000 years. The bond had belonged to a Basque shepherd outside of Bozeman who had died of pneumonia the previous month. Holloway had bought the dog at the estate auction for $11. He had not bought it for himself. "You need a dog out here," he said. He climbed down from his horse. He opened the crate. The dog stepped out and looked at Astrid for a long, quiet moment, the way Pyrenean mountain dogs look at the people they should about to spend the rest of their lives protecting. "His name is Bear," Holloway said. "He does not bark unless he means it. If he barks, you listen." Astrid looked at the dog. The dog looked at Astrid. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she walked over to the dog, and she knelt in the snow in front of him, and she put her hand on his head, and Bear leaned forward and pressed his forehead against her chest and stayed that way, and Astrid closed her eyes. "You can pay me back when the wheat comes in," Holloway said. He climbed back onto his horse. He rode away without looking back. By the first week of June 1883, the structure was complete. Astrid moved into her quarters on a Wednesday evening. The space was 16 feet by 20 feet of actual living area, with the earth berms cutting into the dimensions on 3 sides. The cast iron stove sat in the northwest corner. 2 real glass windows purchased in Fort Benton for 3 months' wages faced south. A small covered porch protected the south-facing door from drifting snow. The ceiling was 7 feet high. Above her quarters lay 8 inches of barn flooring, and above the flooring stood the barn itself, 20 feet by 30 feet, with 12 feet of clearance for the 2 oxen and 3 milk cows she had bought from Holloway on a credit arrangement that paid him back in calves over 3 years. She planted 40 acres in wheat that summer. She built a kitchen garden behind the barn. She rendered tallow from a steer. Holloway had given her in lieu of part of the calf agreement, and she made 42 candles from the tallow, and she stored them in the coolest corner of her quarters, where the temperature stayed at 49 degrees even in July. In late June, she helped a woman named Morella Whitfield rebuild the failing root cellar behind her cabin 3 miles east of Lewistown. Morella was 35 years old, a widow whose husband had died of a fever 2 years earlier, leaving her with a 9-year-old son named Eli, and a quarter section of land she did not know how to work. Astrid showed her how to dig the cellar deeper, how to line the walls with flat stones set in clay, how to angle the entrance so the prevailing wind would not drive snow into the door. They worked together for 2 weeks. Morella cried twice during those 2 weeks, once when she remembered something her husband had said, and once when Eli fell off the roof of the spring house and split his lip, and Astrid held her both times and did not speak and did not let go until Morella was ready to be let go of. This was the summer when Astrid Bergstrom began to be a person again. By the end of July, Reverend Pritchard, who had been deeply skeptical of a single woman homesteading alone, gave a sermon that mentioned her by name and referred to her construction methods as a quiet wisdom that the Lord rewards in his own time. Walter Croft brought Astrid a wagon load of kiln-dried pine planks in early August, refusing payment, mumbling something about extra material from another job. Friedrich Vogel began to stop by on Sunday afternoons to discuss drainage techniques in joist spacing. Thaddeus Holloway sent her a cured ham at the start of harvest with a note that said simply, "You have earned your place here." The wheat came in at 37 bushels an acre. She sold half. She kept half for seed and for grinding into flour. She paid down 60% of her debt to Holloway. She bought a second wool blanket. She bought a new pair of boots. This was the summer when everything went up. This was the false hope. On the morning of July 29, 1883, a Tuesday, an envelope arrived at the Lewistown post office with Astrid Bergstrom's name written in a formal copperplate handwriting on the front. The envelope had been sent from the Federal Land Office in Helena. It was sealed with red wax. The postmaster, a man named Calhoun, looked at the envelope for a long time before he placed it in the slot for outgoing rural delivery. Astrid received the envelope on Friday, August 3rd. She was sitting on the south-facing porch of her quarters when the rural carrier rode up a young man named Theo Ramsey, who handed her the envelope and waited because everyone in Lewistown by that point had learned to wait when they delivered something to Astrid Bergstrom in case there was a response. Astrid opened the envelope. She read the letter inside. She read it twice. She did not change expression. She thanked Theo Ramsey for the delivery. She walked back into her quarters. She set the letter on the table. She sat down beside the cast iron stove. Bear came over and lay down at her feet and pressed his shoulder against her ankle and did not move. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. It was signed by the acting commissioner of the Land Office for the Montana Territory on the recommendation of an advisory board member, identified only by initials. It informed Miss Astrid Bergstrom that a formal challenge had been filed against her registered claim under the Homestead Act of 1862. The challenge alleged that her constructed dwelling did not meet the statutory definition of a habitable structure on the grounds that a structure consisting primarily of subterranean excavation, regardless of its functional adequacy, did not constitute a dwelling within the meaning of Section 4 of the Act. The letter stated that a formal hearing on the matter would be held in Helena on the 14th day of April, 1884. The letter stated that if she failed to appear or failed to successfully defend her claim, her registration would be revoked and the land, together with all improvements, would revert to the public domain and be made available for re-registration. The letter did not mention Cyrus Hardwick by name. It did not need to. Astrid sat beside the stove for a long time. The afternoon sun moved across the floor of her quarters. Bear breathed slowly against her ankle. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a hawk called once over the wheat field she had planted with her own hands. The wheat was beginning to turn. The harvest was a month away. The first hard frost would come in late September. The first snow would come in early November. The hearing would be in April. She had 8 months. She walked over to her stove. She opened the small iron door. She did not put the letter inside. She set it on the table beside the wooden box, and she walked outside, and she stood in the wheat field, and she looked at the hillside she had cut into, and the barn she had raised, and the structure that had taken her every dollar and every breath and every hour of 2 years. She watched the wind move through the wheat. She did not weep. That night she opened the wooden box. She took out the small leather shoe with the brass buckle. She held it in both hands for a long time. She set it beside the stove on the flat stone. She sat down on the floor next to it. Bear came and lay down on the other side of the stone, his great head on his paws, his eyes on her. "I am not done," she said quietly. She said it in Swedish the way she had spoken to Henrik when he was small. "I am not done yet." The wind picked up outside, the first cool wind of August, the wind that means autumn is coming. Somewhere across the basin, a coyote called once. Bear's ears flicked, but he did not move. 8 months. That is how long Astrid Bergstrom had to prove that what she had built was a home. What she did not yet know as she sat beside her stove on that August evening was that Cyrus Hardwick had already begun making a different kind of move. He had already spoken quietly to the senior clerk at the Lewistown General Store. He had already made a private inquiry at the office of the only blacksmith in town. He had already begun the slow, patient work of cutting Astrid Bergstrom off from the small and necessary commerce of frontier life. The kind of work that does not leave fingerprints, the kind of work that bankers had been perfecting for 200 years. And what Astrid did not know, what she could not have known, was that a man named Friedrich Vogel was at that very moment sitting in his cabin 3 miles east of hers, holding a letter of his own, a letter that informed him that the bank held the right to call in his mortgage at any time and at the bank's sole discretion, and that the bank would be pleased to extend the current terms indefinitely so long as Mr. Vogel continued to demonstrate good judgment in his public statements regarding matters of mutual concern. Friedrich Vogel was sitting at his kitchen table with that letter in his hand. His wife Greta was asleep in the next room. His daughter Ingrid, who had not been well for a week, was coughing in her bed. Friedrich Vogel folded the letter. He put it in his pocket. He stood up and walked to the window of his cabin, and he looked out across the dark prairie toward the hillside 3 miles to the west, where Astrid Bergstrom's lantern was just visible through the August night, and he understood in that moment what he was going to have to do. The wind moved through the wheat in the basin between the two cabins. The coyote called again. Somewhere in the high country to the south, the first cold air of autumn was already gathering the air that would build through September and October and November and December and January until it became on a Tuesday night in late January of the following year, the storm that would kill 38 people across the Montana Territory. But that was still 6 months away. Tonight, Astrid Bergstrom sat beside her stove with her son's leather shoe warm on the flat stone, and she did not yet know how much she would lose before she would understand how much she could save. The first thing Astrid noticed was the silence at the general store. She rode into Lewistown on a Saturday morning in the second week of August 1883, with Bear loping alongside her wagon and a list of supplies folded in her coat pocket. The list was not long. 4 pounds of coffee, 2 tins of lamp oil, a new whetstone for the scythe she would need at harvest, a bolt of muslin because the curtains she had hung in the south-facing windows had begun to fade, half a pound of nails, a small jar of sulfur for the chickens she planned to buy in the spring. The bell above the door of Pemberton's General Mercantile rang the way it always rang when she walked in. 2 men were standing at the counter when she entered, a rancher named Whitlow and a farrier whose name she had never learned, and both of them turned to look at her, and both of them looked away, and neither of them said good morning. The clerk behind the counter, a young man named Jasper Pemberton, who was the owner's nephew, and who had always been pleasant to her in a stiff, embarrassed sort of way that suggested he had been raised by a strict mother, went very still when she approached. She set the list on the counter. Jasper looked at the list. Jasper looked at the back wall of the store where the shelves of coffee and lamp oil and bolts of muslin sat exactly where they had always sat. Jasper opened his mouth and closed it again. Jasper said in a voice that was barely above a whisper that he was very sorry, but the store was unfortunately out of every item on her list at the present time, and he did not know when the next shipment would arrive, and he hoped she understood. Astrid stood at the counter for a moment. She looked at Jasper Pemberton's face. She looked at the shelves behind him. She looked at the rancher and the furrier who had stopped looking away and were now staring at her with the specific blank interest of men who were watching something they did not entirely approve of, but were not going to interfere with. "I see," she said. She picked up her list. She folded it back into her coat pocket. She walked out of the store. The bell rang behind her. She stood on the wooden sidewalk for one breath, two breaths, three breaths. She walked four doors down to the office of Cassius Granger, the only blacksmith in Lewistown who had repaired a broken tine on her cultivator in May and had charged her $3.75 for the work, and who had told her at that time that he would be happy to do further work for her at any time. The forge was hot. Cassius Granger was at the anvil. He saw her coming through the open door, and he set down his hammer, and he wiped his hands on his leather apron, and he met her at the threshold before she could come inside. He told her that he was very sorry, but his schedule was completely full for the foreseeable future, and he could not take on any new work, and he hoped she understood, and he was very, very sorry. His face was the color of beet juice. He could not look at her. Astrid had said that she understood. She turned around. She walked back to her wagon. Bear was sitting beside the rear wheel, watching the street with his calm, watchful eyes. She climbed up onto the bench. She picked up the reins. She looked once down the length of the main street of Lewistown, at the 7 other businesses, in the 2 churches, in the small wooden bank, with the brass plaque on its door that read First Bank of Lewistown, Cyrus J. Hardwick, President. And she understood in that moment exactly what was happening to her. It had taken Cyrus Hardwick 11 days. He had not raised his voice. He had not signed his name to any document. He had simply visited each of the merchants in Lewistown over the course of 10 quiet evenings, and he had spoken to them about the importance of supporting sound business practices, and he had reminded several of them about the small and large favors the bank had extended to them over the years. And he had asked them as a personal courtesy to be cautious about extending credit or supplies to homesteaders whose claims were currently the subject of federal review. He had not mentioned Astrid Bergstrom by name. He had not needed to. There was only one homesteader in Lewistown whose claim was currently under federal review. Astrid drove her wagon back to her quarter section without stopping. Bear ran alongside the wagon for the first mile, then jumped up into the bed and rode the rest of the way. When they reached the homestead, Astrid unhitched the team, fed, and watered the horses, walked into her quarters, sat down at the wooden table, and pulled a piece of paper toward her. She wrote a list of every supply she would need to survive the winter without making another trip into Lewistown. She wrote a second list of the merchants in Fort Benton, 90 miles to the north, who had no direct business relationship with the First Bank of Lewistown. She wrote a third list of the items she could produce on her own land by her own hands between August and November. She sat with the 3 lists for a long time. Bear lay at her feet. The afternoon sun moved across the floor. She did not weep. She had not wept in 3 years. The first cut you take from a man like Cyrus Hardwick is the one that teaches you what kind of fight you are in. Astrid Bergstrom understood by sundown that Saturday in August that she was not in a fight about land or about dwellings or about the technical definition of a Homestead Act statute. She was in a fight about whether a woman could be erased from a community by a man who had decided for reasons that had nothing to do with her that her erasure would be convenient. She did not panic. She did not write to her sister Helga in Chicago. She did not write to Thaddeus Holloway, although she could have and he would have come. She did not even speak of it to Morella Whitfield when Morella came by on the following Tuesday with a basket of late summer plums. She simply changed her plan. By the end of August, Astrid had arranged through a teamster named McCabe, who hauled freight between Fort Benton and Helena for her wheat to be shipped directly to a buyer in Fort Benton at the moment of harvest, bypassing the Lewistown elevator entirely. She had also arranged through the same teamster for her winter supplies to be delivered in 2 shipments, one in October and one in early December, sourced from merchants who had never heard of Cyrus Hardwick. McCabe charged her twice the going rate for the freight. She paid it without negotiating. She understood that he was charging her twice the rate because he understood that she had no other options, and she understood that this was simply the price of being a woman alone in Montana when a banker in town had decided to make her invisible. She harvested the wheat in the second week of September. She worked from dawn until full dark for 9 straight days. Bear ran the perimeter of the field and kept the deer out of the standing grain. Morella Whitfield came on the fourth day without being asked, and she brought Eli with her, and the boy tied sheaves alongside his mother for 9 hours and ate the cold biscuits Astrid had left in a tin in the shade. And at the end of the 9th day, Morella said quietly, "I do not know what is happening to you in town, but I know what is happening to you in this field, and I am here for the second one." Astrid put her hand on Morella's shoulder. She did not speak. She did not need to. The wheat went out on McCabe's wagons on the 17th of September. The check from the Fort Benton buyer arrived at her quarters on the 3rd of October, hand-carried by a young man on a fast horse who refused to come inside. The check was for $247. It was the most money Astrid Bergstrom had held in her own hands in her entire life. She did not deposit it at the First Bank of Lewistown. She put it in the wooden box beside the small leather shoe with the brass buckle. That same week, on a cold morning in the first week of October, Friedrich Vogel rode out to her property alone. He came on a single horse. He did not bring in his wagon. He did not bring his tools. He rode up to the south porch, and he sat on his horse for a long time before he dismounted. The way a man sits on a horse when he is trying to put off by 60 seconds or by 2 minutes the conversation he has come to have. When he finally climbed down, his joints made the small, audible complaint that joints make at 63 years old in October cold. He did not tie the horse. The horse stood where it was. Astrid was splitting kindling on the chopping block beside the porch. Bear sat 15 feet away watching. She set down the axe when she saw Friedrich. She wiped her hands on her apron. She said, "Good morning, Mr. Vogel." Friedrich Vogel did not return the greeting. He stood in front of her with his hat in his hands, and he turned the hat in the slow circles by the brim, and he looked at the ground between his boots, and he said in a voice that was not quite steady, "Fräulein Bergstrom, I've come to tell you that I cannot speak for you at the hearing in April." Astrid did not say anything. She waited. "I had hoped Friedrich said that I might be able to come and testify on your behalf to the land office about the structure, about the engineering. I had hoped this for some time." He paused. He turned the hat. He went on. "The bank holds a mortgage on my farm. They have held it since 1879. The terms have always been generous. Last week I received a letter from Mr. Hardwick. The letter informed me that the terms could be extended indefinitely so long as I demonstrated good judgment in matters of mutual concern." He stopped. He looked up at her for the first time since dismounting. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had not slept well in 8 days. "I have a wife," he said. "I have a daughter. Ingrid is 17. I cannot lose the farm, Fräulein, I cannot. I am 63 years old. I have nothing else. If I lose the farm, my family is on the road in winter, and I do not know what becomes of us. I cannot lose the farm." Astrid stood very still. She could have said many things. She could have told him about Eric. She could have told him about Henrik. She could have told him about the $73 she had brought to Lewistown in April of 1882, and the 17 men who had stood ahead of her in the line at the land office, and the wooden box she had carried up the slope of a Montana hillside for 2 years. She could have asked him whether his daughter's life was worth more than the truth. She did not say any of these things. She said, "I understand, Mr. Vogel. You have your family. You have done what a good man does. Please do not trouble yourself further about it." Friedrich Vogel made a sound in his throat that was not quite a word. He looked at her for a long moment. He nodded once. He turned around. He climbed back onto his horse with a slowness that had nothing to do with his joints. He rode away without looking back. Astrid watched him until he disappeared over the rise. Then she picked up the axe. She set a fresh piece of kindling on the chopping block. She brought the axe down. She split the wood. She set another piece. She split that one. She worked until the sun was low. Bear sat 15 feet away the entire time and did not move. That night, she did not open the wooden box. She did not take out the leather shoe. She sat beside the stove with her hands flat on the wooden table, and she stared at the small iron door, and she listened to the wind beginning to come up out of the north for the first time that autumn, and she thought very quietly and very clearly that she had built her life on the wrong foundation. She had thought that what she was building with her shovel and her pickaxe and her 2 years of solitary labor was a structure. She understood now that what she had been building was a target. The October wind came down hard on the basin in the third week of the month. The first snow fell on the 7th of November, 6 inches that melted within 4 days. The second snow fell on the 19th, 14 inches, with the temperature dropping to 4 below zero. The structure performed exactly as Astrid had calculated. Inside her quarters, with the stove running twice daily, the temperature held steady at 61 degrees. The livestock above her, comfortable in the insulated barn, added warmth that radiated down through the floor. She kept records. She wrote everything in a small leather journal she had bought in Helena the summer before. The journal would later be donated to the Montana Historical Society by Morella Whitfield's son and would sit in their archives for 120 years in a temperature-controlled room behind a glass case, where a graduate student from the University of Minnesota would find it in the spring of 2004 and would write a master's thesis about it. But this is later. For now, in the second week of December, Friedrich Vogel came back to Astrid's homestead. This time he came in his wagon. This time his wife Greta was on the bench beside him. This time their 17-year-old daughter Ingrid was lying in the bed of the wagon, wrapped in 3 blankets, her face the color of skim milk, her breathing shallow and ragged, in a way that Astrid recognized before Friedrich said a single word. The chimney, Friedrich called out as he pulled the team up beside the porch. The chimney has cracked. The smoke fills the cabin. We cannot stay there. Greta has been with her for 3 days. But the cold in the cabin and the smoke, the air is bad, and she is not Fräulein Bergstrom. My daughter is dying. Astrid was already running. She caught Ingrid as Friedrich lifted the girl down from the wagon. She did not look at Friedrich's face. She did not need to. She carried Ingrid through the south-facing door down the small flight of steps into the quarters below, and she laid the girl on her own bed, the only bed in the structure, the one she herself had been sleeping in for 6 months. Greta came down the steps behind her, weeping silently the way women of her generation had been taught to weep with one hand pressed against her mouth. Astrid put her hand on Ingrid's forehead. The skin was hot enough to burn. The girl's lips were cracked. Her breath came in short, rapid gasps that did not draw enough air. Astrid lifted the blanket and put her ear against Ingrid's chest, and she heard beneath the rapid breathing the wet, rattling crackle that meant the lower lobes of the lungs were filling with fluid. She had heard that sound before. She had heard it from the chest of her younger brother in 1867, when she was 17 years old and he was 9, and she had heard it from the chest of Eric's mother in 1876, on the night that woman had died in a back bedroom in Stockholm, before Eric and Astrid had left for America. Mr. Vogel, Astrid said, without looking up, you will need to bring up the willow bark from the cellar. The cellar is to the north of the main structure behind the barn. The willow bark is in a glass jar on the 3rd shelf, second from the left. You will also bring me the mustard powder and the camphor. They are in the same room on the shelf above the willow bark. Mrs. Vogel, you will boil water on the stove. You will boil 3 pots. You will not let any of them stop boiling. Do you understand? Greta nodded. Friedrich nodded. They worked through the night. Astrid made a willow bark tea so concentrated that it was the color of strong coffee, and she lifted Ingrid's head in her lap, and she fed the girl spoonfuls of it for the first 3 hours, and the fever broke once and rose again. She made a mustard powder mixed with hot water, and a small handful of camphor spread on a square of clean muslin, and she laid it across Ingrid's chest and shoulders, and she changed the plaster every 2 hours because a mustard plaster left on the skin too long burns, and a mustard plaster taken off too soon does nothing. She kept the door of the quarters cracked 1 inch even when the temperature outside the door dropped to 16 below zero, because pneumonia kills in stagnant air, and the air in the quarters had to move even if moving the air meant burning more wood. They worked through Tuesday night, Wednesday, Wednesday night, Thursday. The fever rose, the fever fell, the fever rose again. On Thursday evening, the fourth night, Ingrid began to mumble. She mumbled in German first. Greta sat on the floor beside the bed and held her daughter's hand and answered her in German, and Astrid did not understand what they were saying, but she did not need to because she had sat at the bedside of dying people in 2 countries, and she knew what a mother and a daughter say to each other in the small hours of the fourth night. Then sometime around 3 in the morning of Friday, Ingrid began to mumble in English, single words, disconnected phrases, snow, the pony, the blue dress, the river. Then very clearly, 3 times in a row, she said the word mama. Greta could not answer. Greta had stopped being able to make sounds an hour earlier. Astrid took Greta's place on the floor beside the bed. She put her hand under Ingrid's head. She lifted the girl's head into her lap. She bent down close to the girl's ear, and she began in a voice so low that Greta could barely hear it to sing. She sang in Swedish. She sang the lullaby her own mother had sung to her in Sundsvall in the years before her mother died of typhus in 1863. The lullaby was older than the Swedish kingdom, a melody that fishermen's wives had sung to their children on the coast of the Baltic Sea for 600 years. Astrid had sung it to her brother in 1867 on the night before he died. She had sung it to Henrik every night for the 4 years of his life. She had sung it to Henrik on the last night in the cabin in Minnesota, before she had gone out to the barn to deliver the breech calf, before she had walked back through the snow at midnight and found her son and her husband in front of the cold hearth. She had not sung the lullaby in 3 years and 1 month. She sang it now very softly into Ingrid Vogel's ear. She sang it through twice. The girl's breathing slowed. The girl's hand moved very slightly on the blanket. Astrid kept singing. She sang it through a third time. By the third time, she could no longer keep her voice steady. By the third time, the tears were running down her face, the first tears she had cried since the morning Olaf Lindquist had carried her out of her own cabin in Minnesota. And Greta Vogel, sitting on the floor on the other side of the bed, looked up and saw her. And Greta Vogel understood in that moment that the woman singing her daughter back to life was not singing only to her daughter. Astrid finished the lullaby a fourth time. She did not start it again. She lowered Ingrid's head gently under the pillow. She wiped her own face with the back of her wrist. She listened to Ingrid breathe. The breathing was slower, quieter. The wet crackle was still there, but it was thinner, less violent. Astrid put her hand on Ingrid's forehead. The fever had begun to break. By dawn on Friday, the worst had passed. By Sunday, Ingrid was sitting up. By the following Wednesday, she was eating thin broth and asking weakly when she could go home. Friedrich Vogel had repaired his chimney by then, working dawn to dusk through 6 December days. And on the 9th day after they had arrived, he loaded his wife and his daughter back into the wagon, and they prepared to leave. Greta came to Astrid before they left. She came alone without Friedrich while Friedrich was outside hitching the team. She walked down into Astrid's quarters and stood at the bottom of the steps and looked across the room at Astrid, who was wrapping a small jar of willow bark and a packet of mustard powder for them to take. She would have died in our cabin, Greta said simply, even with a working chimney. It is too cold there. This place, it holds warmth like a mother holds a child. Astrid did not respond. She kept wrapping the packet. Greta took 2 steps closer. Who did you lose? She said. It was not a question. It was a recognition. Astrid stopped wrapping the packet. She set it on the table. She stood very still for a long moment with her back to Greta. Then she turned around. She told Greta about Eric. She told her about the cabin in Minnesota. She told her about the cracked chimney and the buffalo hide blanket and the cow that had gone into labor and the wooden horse Henrik had been holding and the 36 hours she had spent on the floor of the cabin before Olaf Lindquist had come to borrow a saw. She did not cry while she spoke. She had cried already in the night beside Ingrid's bed. When she was finished, Greta walked across the room and put her arms around her. The two women stood in the center of the underground quarters for a long time. Neither of them spoke. Bear watched them from his place beside the stove. The afternoon light came through the south-facing windows and lay in long, pale rectangles on the wooden floor. This was the second of the quiet moments that men who study these things would later say define the entire arc of Astrid Bergstrom's life. The first had been the night Bear had pressed his forehead against her chest in the snow. The third was still 6 weeks away. The Vogels left that afternoon. By Christmas, the story of what had happened to Ingrid had spread through every household within 30 miles of Lewistown, carried by Greta to the women, carried by Friedrich, very quietly to the men. Cyrus Hardwick heard about it in the first week of January. He heard about it from his own wife's older sister, who was visiting from Helena, and who had heard about it at the women's auxiliary breakfast at the Methodist Church. Cyrus Hardwick set down his coffee cup when he heard. He looked out the window of his dining room. He understood in that moment that he was beginning to lose the public side of the fight even as he continued to win the private one. He understood that a woman who had saved a 17-year-old girl from pneumonia in an underground dwelling had become something more dangerous than a homesteader. She had become a story. And stories in towns the size of Lewistown had a way of reshaping juries and witnesses, and even the careful private arrangements of bankers. He did what men like Cyrus Hardwick do when the public ground begins to shift beneath them. He decided to make an offer. He arrived at Astrid Bergstrom's homestead on the afternoon of January 22nd, 1884. Riding alone in a black overcoat trimmed with beaver fur on a chestnut gelding, worth more than the entire value of Astrid's livestock. He did not bring a witness. He did not bring a clerk. He carried in the inside pocket of his overcoat 3 documents, 2 of them already signed by him. He knocked on the south-facing door. Astrid opened the door. Bear stood at her left side. She did not invite Cyrus Hardwick inside. She did not need to. Cyrus Hardwick removed his hat and stood on the small covered porch, and he spoke in the calm, professional voice that he used at board meetings. He told her that he had been thinking very seriously about her situation for some weeks. He told her that he respected what she had built, that he respected her tenacity, that he respected in particular what she had done for the Vogel family. He told her that the federal hearing in April was, in his professional opinion, going to go very badly for her, but that there was no reason for things to reach that conclusion. He removed the documents from his inside pocket. The first document was a private offer of purchase drafted by his own attorney in Helena. It offered Astrid Bergstrom $3,200 for her quarter section, including the structure, the barn, the livestock, and the standing improvements. This was approximately 4 times the going rate for a Montana homestead in the winter of 1884. Cyrus Hardwick knew this. He said the figure aloud as if he were doing her a kindness. The second document was a guarantee also drafted by his attorney that if Astrid signed the offer of purchase and vacated the property within 30 days, Cyrus Hardwick would personally use his influence on the Federal Land Office Advisory Board to ensure that the formal challenge to her claim was withdrawn before the April hearing. There would be no judgment against her. There would be no public record of any allegation. She would walk away as a woman who had simply chosen to sell her land at a profit. The third document was a first-class railroad voucher, paid in advance from Lewistown to Chicago sleeper car, included departing on the 7th of February, 1884. He had purchased the voucher himself the previous Tuesday. He laid the 3 documents on the small wooden bench beside the door. He did not press her to look at them. Mrs. Bergstrom, he said, and it was the first time he had ever called her Mrs., and she noticed it and he saw her notice. Mrs. Bergstrom, my wife was named Astrid. She died 12 years ago. Childbirth. The boy lived. His name is Edward. He is 12 years old now. He lives in Helena with his grandmother. I see him perhaps 3 times a year. I have been a banker for 30 years. I have made a great deal of money. I have not in any way that I would defend before a fair God used that money well. He paused. The wind moved across the porch. Bear watched him without moving. I am building a future for my son, Urs, Hardwick said. The railroad will come through this basin in 1887 or 1888. I have purchased 11 sections along its expected route. Yours is the 12th. I will not insult you by telling you I am sorry. I am not sorry. I am pragmatic. But I will tell you this. You and I have both buried people. You and I both know what loss does to a soul. I am not your enemy. I am simply a man who has decided what his son is going to inherit. If you are wise, you will take this offer. If you are not, the federal hearing will take everything from you anyway, and you will leave Montana with nothing. And your husband and your son will have died for a hillside that was always going to belong to someone like me. He turned around. He walked down the steps. He mounted his horse. He rode away without looking back. Astrid stood in the open doorway for a long time. The wind blew the documents off the wooden bench. They scattered across the small porch. She watched them flutter against the railing. She did not try to gather them. Bear pressed his shoulder against her thigh. She closed the door. She went down into her quarters. She sat at the wooden table. She did not light a lamp, although the afternoon was beginning to fail. The light from the south-facing windows fell across the table, across her hands, across the small wooden box that sat at the center of the table. She opened the wooden box. She took out the leather shoe with the brass buckle. She set the shoe on the table. She took out the folded letter from her sister Helga in Chicago, the one she had not answered in 2 years. She unfolded it. She read the first paragraph. She read the second paragraph. She read the third. She refolded the letter. She set it beside the shoe. She picked up a pen. She found a clean sheet of paper. She began to write. Mr. Hardwick, she wrote, after careful consideration of your offer of January 22nd, 1884, I have decided to accept the terms as you have described them. She kept writing. She wrote the letter the way a banker writes a letter, in the formal third person with proper paragraph breaks, in a closing line that thanked Mr. Hardwick for his consideration of her circumstances. She signed her name at the bottom. She blotted the ink. She folded the letter into thirds. She sealed it with a small dab of beeswax from the candle on the table. She set the sealed letter on the table beside the leather shoe. She sat there for a long time. The afternoon light failed. The room grew dark. The cast iron stove ticked as the fire inside it settled. Bear lay at her feet and did not move. She did not light a lamp. Sometime around midnight, she lit a single candle. She placed the candle on the table between the shoe and the letter. The flame was small. The shadows it threw against the earthen walls of her quarters were tall and unsteady. She looked at the letter. She looked at the shoe. If I leave, she thought, I will be burying him a second time. Not just Henrik, not just Eric. I will be burying every breath I have taken for 3 years to convince myself that what I lost meant something. I will be agreeing with my signature that the work I did on this hillside was the work of a fool. I will be telling Henrik, who is not here to hear it, that the hands that sang to him every night for 4 years were not strong enough to keep one promise. She thought about the lullaby. She thought about Ingrid Vogel sitting up in bed eating thin broth. She thought about Greta Vogel's arms around her in the middle of the room. She thought about Eric's face in the firelight in the cabin in Minnesota in the spring of 1879, the night he had hammered the brass buckle into the small leather shoe. She picked up the sealed letter. She held it in both hands above the candle flame. She let the flame catch the edge of the paper. The paper burned. The wax seal melted and dripped onto the table. She held the letter until the flame was almost at her fingers, and then she dropped the last burning corner into the empty tin cup beside the candle, and she watched it burn out, and the room smelled for a few seconds of beeswax and cheap cotton paper. She blew out the candle. She sat in the dark. Outside, the wind began to come up. It came up out of the north the way the worst winds in Montana always come up, and it built across the basin at a steady increasing rate over the next 18 hours. By dawn on Tuesday, the 23rd of January, the wind was strong enough to lay down the wheat stubble in the fields. By noon, the temperature had dropped to 8 degrees above zero and was falling fast. By 2 in the afternoon, the sky to the north had turned the color of slate. Astrid stood at the south, facing windows of her quarters, and watched the storm come. Thaddeus Holloway rode up at 12:17. His horse was lathered and skittish. He did not dismount. He called out from the saddle. His face was already raw from the wind. Barometer dropped 4 inches in 6 hours, he shouted. My bones tell me this is the bad one. How is your wood supply? 3 cords stacked in the barn, Astrid called back. Another cord here in the quarters. That will do you. Listen to me. Do not go outside, not for animals, not for wood, not for anything. Once this hits you, stay where you are. Do you understand? I understand. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. The wind whipped his coat around his legs. Astrid, he said, and it was the first time he had ever used her given name. Astrid, you and yours stay safe. Same to you, she said. He turned the horse. He rode hard for his own ranch 4 miles to the north. The storm hit at 4:47 in the afternoon. Astrid was at the south-facing windows when it came. She watched the wall of white advance across the prairie from the north, a moving cliff of snow and wind that she would later read had measured 1,100 feet high at its leading edge and had been driven by sustained winds of 73 miles per hour. The wall hit the rise above her property at 4:47 exactly. She watched the trees on the far ridge bend, snap, and disappear into the white. She felt the structure above her shudder. She heard the timbers of the barn flex against their bracing. The light in the south-facing windows turned to nothing. Astrid stepped back from the windows. She walked to her stove. She fed it 3 split logs. She sat down in the chair beside it. Bear lay down at her feet. The temperature outside dropped through the afternoon. By 6 in the evening, 18 below. By 8 in the evening, 27 below. By 9 in the evening, 34 below. The wind never paused. It was a constant living roar, like standing beside a freight train that did not move and did not end. Inside her quarters, the temperature held at 64 degrees. At 10:32 in the evening of January 23rd, 1884, the moment the prologue of this story had been waiting for arrived. The knock came in the middle of a wind that was now gusting to 90 miles an hour. 3 sharp blows. The same 3 blows you heard at the beginning of this telling before you knew who Astrid Bergstrom was, before you knew about the cabin in Minnesota, before you knew about Eric or Henrik or the leather shoe with the brass buckle on the flat stone beside the stove. Now you know. Astrid stood up. She did not pause this time. She had already done her pausing. She crossed the 7 steps to the door, lifted the latch, and pulled the door inward against the storm. Outside on her small covered porch in the howling dark of the worst blizzard the Montana Territory would see for 30 years, 4 people stood crusted in ice and barely able to remain upright. Reverend Pritchard, Morella Whitfield, Eli Whitfield, 9 years old in his mother's arms, his hands already blackening at the tips, and Owen Croft, 22 years old, the nephew of Walter Croft, who had been staying alone in a surveyor's shack 2 miles to the west. Reverend Pritchard's mouth moved. The words took a long time to come. Our cabins, he said, the wind, we saw your light. Please. Astrid pulled them inside. She closed the door against the storm. The fight she had been preparing for 2 years and 3 months was about to begin. The first thing Astrid did after she pulled the 4 of them through the door and threw the bolt against the storm was to count them. She counted them twice. Reverend Pritchard leaning against the door frame, his beard frozen into a single white sheet across his chest. Morella Whitfield on her knees on the floor where she had collapsed the moment the door closed behind her. Eli Whitfield, 9 years old in his mother's arms, his small body slack against her, his eyes half open and unfocused. Owen Croft, 22 years old, his coat torn, his right glove, missing his bare hand the color of old wax. 4, she had counted 4, She counted them again to be certain her mind was still working. 4 was the right number. She moved. She moved the way her grandfather had taught her to move on the night the village fishing fleet came home in 1861 when she was 11 years old, and her grandfather had set her at the kitchen door of the small stone house in Sundsvall and said, when men come back from a winter sea, you do not ask them how they feel. You take their wet things off them and you put dry things on them in that order before you do anything else. Because the cold kills slowly and the cold kills fast, and you cannot tell which one is killing them until the dry clothes are on. She stripped Owen Croft's torn coat off him first because he was nearest. She did not ask permission. She did not explain. She unbuttoned his coat at the throat and pulled it down off his shoulders and let it fall to the floor, and she peeled his frozen wool shirt off him, and she could see the red and white blotches across his chest where the cold had begun to work into the muscle. She wrapped him in 2 of her own wool blankets. She pushed him toward the stove. She did the same for Reverend Pritchard. She did not look at his face when she opened his coat. She had learned in 3 years of being a widow that a man's dignity in moments like this is best preserved by treating his body as a problem to be solved rather than as a person to be embarrassed. She turned to Morella last. Morella was already pulling her own coat off, working with the slow, trembling fingers of someone whose hands had gone past pain into the dull, blank state that comes before frostbite turns permanent. Astrid took Eli from her. She carried the boy to the stove. She set him on the floor on his mother's coat. She unwrapped the buffalo robe Morella had wrapped him in. She unwrapped the wool scarf around his face. She unwrapped his small mittens. His hands were the worst of it. The fingertips of both hands had gone past white into the deep waxy gray that meant the tissue underneath had begun to die. Astrid knew this color. She had seen it once before on the right foot of a Norwegian fisherman in Sundsvall Harbor in 1862, who had lost 3 toes and most of his heel before his wife had been able to thaw him out beside a kitchen stove. Mrs. Whitfield, Astrid said in a voice that was steady because she had decided it would be steady, I need you to bring me the basin from beside the washstand. I need you to fill it with water from the kettle. The water must be warm, not hot, warm, the temperature you would use to bathe a baby. Do you understand? Morella understood. Morella moved. Astrid worked on Eli's hands for the next 40 minutes. She did not let the water go above 104 degrees, the temperature Greta Vogel had taught her in December, the temperature that thaws frozen tissue without killing the cells underneath. She held each of his hands in the basin in turn, and she watched the color come back, and it came back wrong in patches, with white spots remaining in the very tips of 3 fingers on his right hand and 2 fingers on his left. She wrapped his hands in soft cloth. She kept the cloth dry. She did not break the blisters when they came up. Eli did not wake. His breathing was shallow but steady. His skin was the cold, pale white of a child whose body had spent its last reserves on the walk through the storm. Reverend Sir Pritchard sat in the chair beside the stove and stared at his hands, and said in a voice that did not sound like his preaching voice, Our cabins, the wind tore Morella's roof off mine, was filling with snow through cracks I did not know existed. Owen was staying in the old surveyor's shack, and we knew it would not last the night. We saw your light through the snow. We walked. I do not know how long we walked. I do not know how we did not lose Eli on the walk. I do not know. Astrid did not answer him. She put a tin cup of warm broth into his hands, and she closed his fingers around it, and she said, Drink this slowly. Then she went back to Eli. The wind outside continued to roar. The temperature inside the quarters had dropped from 64 to 58 in the time it had taken her to get them through the door and out of their wet clothes and beside the stove. She fed the stove 3 more split logs. She watched the temperature climb back to 61. She had supplies for 10 days alone with careful rationing. 5 people would burn through her food in 5 days. She would need to go to 14 days, possibly more. She did not know how long the storm would last. No one did. She did the calculations the way her father had taught her to do calculations on a piece of paper with the pencil her grandfather had given her on her 10th birthday, sitting at the wooden table beside the stove while her four uninvited guests slept on the floor and on the bed and in the chair. She wrote down the weight of the venison still hanging in the coal box behind the stove. She wrote down the pounds of flour in the barrel under the south-facing window. She wrote down the potatoes, the dry beans, the lard, the salt, the coffee which she would not be drinking. She divided each number by 5. She divided it again by 14. The numbers worked. Barely. She blew out the lamp. She sat in the dark beside the stove. Bear lay across her feet. Day 1 of the storm became day 2. The temperature outside fell to 41 below by dawn on Wednesday the 24th. The wind did not slacken. Astrid had read everything she could find about Montana blizzards before she had built her structure, and she knew that storms of this severity usually broke within 36 hours. This one did not break. It held its strength through Wednesday and into Wednesday night and through the entire day of Thursday the 25th. On Thursday afternoon, something broke in the barn above them. It was a cracking sound, low and wooden, followed by a heavy shifting that traveled down through the 8 inches of barn flooring above their heads. The cattle bellowed. Bear stood up and faced the ceiling. Owen Croft, who had recovered enough by Thursday to be useful, looked at Astrid and said one of the support braces. The accumulated snow load on the north side. We have to go up. We do not, Astrid said. She did not raise her voice. She did not stand up. She kept her hands where they were folded on the table. Miss Bergstrom Owen said, if a second brace goes, the whole north side of the barn could come down. The cattle will be lost. The weight could compromise the floor. Astrid looked at him. The boy was 22 years old. He was Walter Croft's nephew. He had come from Pennsylvania and he had spent 4 months learning to read the Montana wind, and he was still very young and he did not yet understand the most important thing about a Montana blizzard at 40 below zero, which was that the structures you have built are either going to hold or they are not, and there is nothing a man can do about it once the storm is upon him, except stay alive inside the calculation he made before the storm arrived. You will go up there, she said, and you will not come back down. The wind will take you off the roof. You will be dead before any of us can pull you back. The barn was built for this. I designed it for snow loads, up to 4 feet on every roof surface. The diagonal bracing distributes the load. If a brace has gone, the structure will redistribute. The cattle may be lost. The cattle are not worth your life, Mr. Croft. Sit down. Owen Croft sat down. He did not speak again for 2 hours. Day 3, Friday morning. The wind dropped briefly for the first time in 58 hours. The temperature climbed from 41 below to 32 below. The light coming through the layer of snow piled against the south-facing windows turned from pure black to a kind of dim, translucent gray. Owen Croft suggested quietly that they should make a run for Lewistown. Surely the worst was over. Astrid walked to the south-facing windows. She stood very still and looked out at what was visible through the small space at the top of the windows where the snow had not yet reached. She saw in the dim gray light the shape of the rise where the barn met the hillside. The drift on the north side of the barn was 11 feet deep. The terrain was unrecognizable. She could see no structures. She could see no fences. She could see no horizon. The world had been edited down to white. We stay, she said. By evening on Friday, the wind picked back up. By midnight on Friday, the temperature was 37 below. By Saturday morning, the storm was as bad as it had ever been. Day 4, Morella broke. She did not break loudly. She broke quietly in the corner of the room where she had been sitting beside her sleeping son, and she put her head in her hands and she began to cry without making any sound, the way women of her generation had been taught to cry when crying was unavoidable. She cried for her cabin, which she knew now was gone. She cried for her root cellar, which Astrid had helped her dig, and which was now buried under 15 feet of snow. She cried for the photograph of her husband she had left on the mantel because she had not had time to gather it. She cried for the small wooden cradle in which Eli had slept his first 6 months, which her husband had built her from cherry wood, the spring he had died. Eli, awake now and weak, watched his mother cry. He did not know how to comfort her. He was 9 years old and his hands were wrapped in cloth, and he hurt in a way he had never hurt before, and he understood for the first time in his life that his mother was a person who could be hurt as much as he could be hurt, and the understanding made him afraid. Astrid sat down on the floor beside Morella. She did not say anything. She did not put her hand on Morella's shoulder. She simply sat there beside her in silence, the way she had sat in silence beside Morella in the wheat field when Morella had cried for her husband 2 summers earlier. After a long time, Morella leaned sideways until her head rested against Astrid's shoulder. The two women sat that way for an hour. Reverend Pritchard, in his chair beside the stove, watched them. He did not speak. He had stopped trying to lead them in prayer on the second day. He had understood sometime around the middle of the second night that the woman who had taken them in did not need anyone to lead her, and that the rest of them were in a real sense simply guests in her house and her competence. Day 5. The food began to run short. Astrid had stretched the meat as far as it could go. The last of the venison had gone into the stew on Saturday night. By Sunday morning, all that remained was flour potatoes, dried beans lard, and a small jar of preserved plums Morella Whitfield had brought her in August. She made flat bread on the stove top. She boiled potatoes whole in their skins to keep the starch and the heat in. She served small portions. Everyone was hungry all the time now. Eli's fever began that morning. It came on gradually at first. He grew warm to the touch, sometime around 10 in the morning. By noon, his cheeks were flushed, and his eyes had the bright, too clear look of a child whose body was beginning to fight an infection. By 2 in the afternoon, the wrappings on the worst of his frostbitten fingers showed the first dark spotting. That meant the tissue had begun to break down beneath the cloth, and the blackened tissue had become an open route for whatever bacteria had been on his skin or in the air or in the cloth itself. By 4 in the afternoon, Eli's temperature was high enough that Astrid could feel it without touching him by the heat radiating off his skin from a foot away. Morella understood what was happening before Astrid said anything. She had nursed her husband through the fever that had killed him. She had nursed 3 other children, none of whom had lived past the age of 2 through fevers that had killed them. She knew the smell of a child whose body was beginning to be overwhelmed. She knew the way the breathing changed. Astrid, she said, quietly, the voice of a woman who had lived this exact moment before. Astrid, my boy is going to die. Astrid did not answer. She walked across the room to the coal box behind the stove. She took out the last of the lard. She mixed it with the willow bark powder she had ground that morning and a small handful of camphor. She made a pulp. She unwrapped Eli's hands and cleaned the worst of the blackened tissue with a clean cloth dipped in boiled water, and she packed the pulp into the wounds, and she rewrapped the hands in fresh cloth. She fed him willow bark tea with a spoon. He swallowed 3 spoonfuls before he turned his face away. The fever climbed. By midnight on Sunday, the boy's temperature was high enough that he had begun to shake. He was no longer sweating, which Astrid understood was very bad. His body had begun to give up the fight. Morella held him. She rocked him. She sang to him very softly in a voice that was not steady. The song she sang was a song her own mother had sung to her in Vermont when she was a child, a song about a small boat going home across a quiet harbor in the evening. Astrid stood beside the stove and listened to Morella sing. She thought about Henrik. She thought about the lullaby. She thought about Greta Vogel's daughter sitting up in bed 2 months earlier, eating thin broth. She thought about the wooden box. She turned around and walked slowly to the small chest of drawers beside her bed. She knelt down on the floor. She pulled open the bottom drawer. She removed 2 folded blankets and a small package of cotton sheeting. Underneath these, at the very bottom of the drawer, was the wooden box she had carried from Minnesota in 1882. She lifted the box out. She set it on the floor beside her. She knelt beside it for a long moment. Bear came over and lay down on the other side of the box and watched her. She opened the box. The leather shoe with the brass buckle was inside. She lifted it out and set it on the floor. Beneath the shoe, wrapped in a piece of soft wool that had once been part of a baby's blanket, was a small knitted scarf. The scarf was made of brown wool. It was 12 inches long and 4 inches wide. Her husband Eric had knitted it himself, working in the evenings beside the hearth in the cabin in Minnesota in the autumn of 1879, 6 weeks before Henrik's third birthday. Eric had been a carpenter, not a knitter, and the scarf showed the patient, slow effort of a man who was teaching himself a new craft because his small son had asked him for a scarf like the one his mother wore. The scarf had been around Henrik's neck on the night he died. Astrid had taken it off the boy's body before Olaf Lindquist had carried her out of the cabin. She had not unwrapped the scarf in 3 years and 1 month. She unwrapped it now. She held it for a moment in both hands. She did not cry. She had cried in December beside Ingrid Vogel's bed. She did not have any tears left for the scarf. She carried the scarf across the room. She knelt beside Eli. She wrapped the scarf very carefully around the boy's neck and across his small shoulders the way Eric had wrapped it around Henrik's neck on the morning Henrik had asked to wear it to the barn. The scarf was warm. The wool was the kind of wool that had been bred for Swedish winters by farmers 600 years before any of them had been born. Then she went back to the wooden box. Beneath the wool wrapping that had held the scarf was a small leather pouch. The pouch was old soft, the leather worn dark by handling. Inside the pouch were 47 gold dollar coins. United States Mint, all of them dated between 1871 and 1879. Eric Bergstrom had saved these coins, 1 or 2 at a time, over 6 years of carpentry work in Minnesota. He had given them to Astrid in October of 1879, 2 months before he died, and he had said to her in his careful Swedish, "This is the money for the next bad year. Do not spend it on anything that is not the next bad year." Astrid had carried the pouch from Minnesota to Montana. She had not spent a single coin from it in 2 years and 3 months. The $47 represented the only true reserve she had in the world. They were the price of a one-way ticket on a stagecoach to Chicago, with enough left over to live for 6 weeks in her sister Helga's brick row house while she tried to find work. They were her only escape if everything went wrong at the federal hearing in April. They were the difference between leaving Montana with options and leaving Montana with nothing. She closed her hand around the pouch. She walked across the room to where Owen Croft sat beside the stove. "Mr. Croft," she said, "wake up." Owen, who had been dozing, sat up. "When the storm breaks," she said, "you are going to ride to the Holloway Ranch. Mr. Holloway will give you a young calf. You will pay him with this." She held out the pouch. "You will tell him that I need the meat and the marrow. You will tell him that Eli Whitfield has septic infection in his hands and that we need fresh meat and fresh marrow for broth. You will not tell him where this money came from. You will tell him that if there is any change, he is to keep it against my future debts." Owen looked at the pouch. He did not take it. "Miss Bergstrom," he said, "that is a great deal of money. That is more money than most homesteads see in a year." "There is no need." "There is need," Astrid said. "Mr. Holloway will give you a calf for a fraction of that," Owen said. "Whatever this money is for, it is not for a calf." "It is for a calf," Astrid said. She placed the pouch in his hand. She closed his fingers around it. She did not let go for a long moment. "Mr. Croft," she said, "this money is for whatever the boy needs. If the calf is not enough, you will buy whatever else is required. A doctor from Helena if the storm has cleared the rail line. A second calf, a third. A wagon to carry the boy to Helena himself if his hands cannot be saved here. You will spend it all if you have to. Do you understand?" "I understand," Owen said. He looked down at the pouch in his hand. He looked back up at her. The look on his face was the look of a young man who had just understood that the woman in front of him had handed him something more valuable than money. Morella Whitfield was watching them from across the room. She did not understand the meaning of what was passing between them. She understood only that something was happening, something between Astrid and the young man, and that the something had to do with her son. Reverend Pritchard in his chair also watched. Astrid walked back to Eli. She knelt beside him. She put her hand on his forehead. The fever was still climbing. She kept her hand on his forehead through the long hours of Sunday night and through the dawn of Monday morning, the sixth day of the storm, when the wind which had screamed without pause for 130 hours abruptly stopped. The silence woke them. The silence was so sudden and so total that it pulled Reverend Pritchard out of his chair and Morella up from the floor. Astrid lifted her hand from Eli's forehead. She looked toward the south-facing windows. The light coming through the snow against the glass was different now. Not gray, pale blue, pre-dawn. She stood up. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the bolt. "It is over," she said. She slid the bolt back. She pushed the door against the snow. The door opened 6 inches and stuck. She put her shoulder against it. It opened 12 inches. Owen Croft came up beside her, and the two of them pushed together until the door was open enough to let a person through. The cold came in like a knife. The temperature outside, she would learn later, was 29 degrees below zero. Under a clear black sky, the stars were so bright that she could see them perfectly through the gap above the porch. The wind was gone. The world was silent. Astrid stepped out onto the porch. The snow on the porch was 8 inches deep. The drift in front of the door was 3 feet high. The rest of the world beyond the porch had become a single white surface that bore no resemblance to anything she remembered. She stood there for a long moment. Bear stood beside her. The dog's breath made small white clouds in the starlight. Behind her in the warm quarters below, her son's leather shoe sat on the floor beside the open wooden box. Eli Whitfield slept under the brown wool scarf Eric Bergstrom had knitted in the autumn of 1879. The fever had broken at 4 in the morning. She had not noticed when. She had been too busy keeping her hand on the boy's forehead and watching the snow against the windows and waiting for the wind to stop. It took the 5 of them 3 hours to dig a path from the south-facing door to open ground. When they finally emerged onto the surface just before noon on Monday, the 29th of January, 1884, they found a world they did not recognize. The Vogel cabin 3 miles to the east was half collapsed under the snow load. The old surveyor's shack where Owen had been staying was gone. Just splinters scattered across the ice. Reverend Pritchard's parsonage was buried to the eaves. Morella Whitfield's small frame house 4 miles to the southeast no longer existed. Thaddeus Holloway arrived on horseback at 12:47 in the afternoon. He was leading 2 spare horses. He pulled up short when he saw the 5 of them standing outside the barn. "You are alive," he said. There was genuine surprise in his voice. He climbed down. "Reverend," he said, "we found your parsonage at dawn. We thought you had frozen there." "Mrs. Whitfield, your boy, my God." He looked at Eli. He looked at Astrid. 38 people died in this storm, he said. 11 in town alone. They froze in their own homes when they ran out of wood or their chimneys failed. Another 14 ranchers and homesteaders caught outside. The rest scattered in cabins that could not hold the heat. The Muller boy, the Anderson family, all 5 of them. Old Henry Travers in his bunkhouse. He looked at Astrid for a long, quiet moment. "Do you know what you have built here?" he said. Astrid looked at her structure. She looked at the barn with the north wall pushed in by snow, but the main framing intact. She looked at the small chimney rising above the snow line, still warm, still drawing. "A shelter," she said. Thaddeus Holloway shook his head. "You have built an answer," he said. The federal hearing was held in Helena, in a small wood-paneled room on the 2nd floor of the land office building on the morning of April 14th, 1884. The hearing was scheduled for 2 hours. It lasted 6. Cyrus Hardwick was not there in person. He had submitted his challenge in writing. His attorney, a polished young man from St. Louis named Whitcomb, was present to represent the challenge. Whitcomb had a leather portfolio and a careful smile and the calm, professional manner of a man who had won 14 of his last 15 land office challenges. Astrid Bergstrom was there alone at the petitioner's table. She wore a black dress that she had altered herself from a dress that had been her mother's. Her hair was pulled back. She had a single sheet of paper in front of her. The acting commissioner was a man named Samuel Thorpe. He was 61 years old. He had served in the land office for 27 years. He was known in Helena as a fair man who did not enjoy being lobbied. Whitcomb opened. He spoke for 40 minutes. He cited Section 4 of the Homestead Act of 1862. He cited 3 federal precedents from Nebraska and the Dakota Territory. He argued with great clarity that a structure consisting primarily of a subterranean excavation, regardless of its functional warmth or its emotional appeal, did not constitute a habitable dwelling within the meaning of the statute. He asked the acting commissioner to revoke Miss Bergstrom's claim. Astrid's witnesses began to enter the room. The first to walk through the door was Friedrich Vogel. Astrid had not asked him to come. She had not seen him since the day in October when he had told her he could not testify. She had not known he was coming until he walked into the room. He was wearing his Sunday suit. His wife Greta walked beside him. His daughter Ingrid, now fully recovered, with color in her cheeks and her hair pinned up the way a young woman's hair is pinned up, walked behind them. Friedrich looked at Astrid across the room. He did not smile. He did not nod. He simply walked to the witness table and he sat down and he waited to be sworn. When he was asked his profession, he gave it. When he was asked how long he had built homestead structures in the United States of America, he said 23 years. When he was asked to assess Miss Bergstrom's structure on its engineering merits, he spoke for 31 minutes. He explained the foundation work, the bedrock anchor, the load distribution of the joist system, the drainage calculations, the thermal mass principle that had kept 5 people alive in a storm that had killed 38 others. He spoke in his German accented English, and the room listened to him without interrupting. When Whitcomb began to cross-examine him, Friedrich looked Whitcomb in the eye and said, "Before you ask me your first question, young man, you should know that I am here today against the explicit instructions of Mr. Cyrus Hardwick, who holds a mortgage on my farm and who has informed me that my willingness to testify will result in immediate foreclosure. I am here anyway. My wife told me to come. I would like that on the record, please." The acting commissioner instructed the clerk to record the statement. Whitcomb did not have a follow-up question. Owen Croft testified next. He brought engineering drawings he had prepared during the previous winter, scale drawings of the structure, the snow load calculations, the temperature gradient measurements he had taken on 3 separate occasions in February of 1884. He spoke for 19 minutes. The drawings were entered into evidence. Reverend Pritchard testified. He described the night of the blizzard. He described the structure. He did not weep, but his voice broke once. Morella Whitfield testified. She brought Eli with her. The boy showed the acting commissioner his hands. The fingertips on 3 of his fingers had been amputated at the first joint by a surgeon in Helena, paid for by the gold coins Owen Croft had carried from the homestead the morning after the storm. The remaining fingers were healed. He could use them. He could hold a pencil. Thaddeus Holloway was the final witness. He carried a leather portfolio of his own. Inside the portfolio were maps. He laid the maps on the table in front of the acting commissioner. He explained calmly and at length that he had spent the past 2 months making inquiries through a personal friend in the offices of the Northern Pacific Railroad in Minneapolis. The maps showed the proposed route of the railroad's northern extension through the Judith Basin. The map showed the 11 quarter sections that Cyrus Hardwick had quietly purchased over the previous 18 months along that proposed route. The map showed that Astrid Bergstrom's quarter section was the 12th such section, and that Mr. Hardwick's challenge to her claim coincided exactly with the moment her property had become the last unacquired link in the route. Thaddeus Holloway also produced a copy of Mr. Hardwick's signed appointment to the Federal Land Office Advisory Board, dated 3 years earlier. The acting commissioner spent 36 minutes reading the documents. He recessed the hearing for the day. He ruled the following morning in favor of Astrid Bergstrom. He did not dismiss the underlying question of statutory definition, which he said was a matter for Congress to clarify. He ruled instead that the challenge had been brought in bad faith by an officer of the Land Office Advisory Board with an undisclosed financial interest in the outcome, and that under the circumstances, no reasonable consideration could be given to the substantive merit of the challenge, and that Miss Bergstrom's claim was confirmed in full. He referred Mr. Hardwick to the territorial governor for review of his fitness to continue serving on the advisory board. Cyrus Hardwick resigned from the advisory board within the week. He resigned from the presidency of the First Bank of Lewistown 3 months later. He sold the bank to a consortium of investors from Minneapolis at a loss of approximately $11,000. He moved to Helena, where his son Edward was now 13 years old. Within a year, he had relocated again, this time to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he died in 1891 of complications from pneumonia at the age of 57. He never went to prison. The financial records that would have supported a criminal prosecution had been carefully maintained. He simply lost his place. He lost his standing. He lost the future he had been building for his son. Edward Hardwick, who was raised by his grandmother and who never knew his father well, became a country doctor in eastern Wisconsin and lived a quiet life and died in 1946 at the age of 76. 2 days before Cyrus Hardwick left Lewistown for Helena in the spring of 1884, a single envelope arrived at Astrid Bergstrom's homestead. It was hand-carried by a young man on a fast horse. There was no return address. Inside was a single sheet of writing paper. 3 words were written on it in formal copperplate hand. My wife also was named Astrid. I wish you well. Astrid read the note. She walked to her stove. She opened the small iron door. She set the note on top of the burning logs. She watched it curl and blacken and turn to ash. She closed the iron door. She did not respond. She did not need to. The note had not been a request for forgiveness. It had been the closing of a ledger. She allowed it to close. The summers passed. In 1885, a builder from Great Falls came to study her structure and asked permission to use the design. She gave it. She did not charge him. In 1886, a writer from the Helena Independent interviewed her for an article on innovative frontier architecture. The article ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. She did not save a copy. By the spring of 1887, the term Bergstrom-style cabin had begun to appear in conversations from the Judith Basin to the eastern slopes of the Bitterroots. The Territorial Agricultural Extension Office in Helena published a small pamphlet that summer distributed free to new homesteaders containing scaled drawings and construction notes based on her design. The pamphlet was reprinted in 1889, 1891, and 1894. Engineers from the University of Minnesota visited her property in 1889. Astrid was 39 years old by then. They asked her if she would consider lecturing at the university in the autumn term. She declined politely. She told them that she was a homesteader, not a lecturer, and that she would be needed for the wheat harvest. She did agree to answer their written questions by letter, which she did over the course of 14 months in a correspondence that filled 6 bound volumes now held in the rare books collection of the university library. In February of 1886, during another blizzard less severe than the storm of 1884, but bad enough, Astrid took shelter in Lewistown at the workshop of Owen Croft. Owen had become a builder by then, specializing in earth-integrated structures. He was 24 years old. He told her, watching the snow fall past the window of his workshop, that 7 families had ridden out the storm in Bergstrom-style cabins. None of them had lost anyone. Reverend Pritchard, he said, told me last week that he is no longer afraid of bad weather, says he knows his family is safe. Astrid thought about that. 7 families, roughly 35 people who were not afraid of winter anymore because they had built with the land instead of against it. She stayed in her quarters for 19 years. In 1903, when she was 53 years old, she sold her homestead to a young couple from Wisconsin named Halverson. She walked them through every aspect of the structure's maintenance. She gave them her journal, which contained 19 years of temperature records, snow load measurements, drainage observations, and notes on every modification she had made over the years. She did not ask for payment beyond the agreed price for the property. She told them only that the structure had been built to keep people alive, and that as long as they remembered that they would be all right. She moved into Morella Whitfield's house in Lewistown. Morella had been widowed a second time in 1899. She had remarried in 1893 a kind, quiet man named Albert Cruz who had run the dry goods store in Lewistown for 20 years. Albert had died of a stroke at the age of 57, and Morella had been alone in the house for 4 years before Astrid came to live with her. Eli Whitfield was 29 years old by then. He had become a builder himself, like Owen Croft. He worked alongside Owen, and the two of them had built more than 60 Bergstrom-style structures across the eastern half of the Montana Territory by the time Astrid arrived in town. Eli had married a woman named Susan in 1898. They had a son, born in 1901, whom Eli had named for his father, Daniel. Astrid lived with Morella for 6 years. She caught pneumonia in the second week of November 1909. She was 59 years old. The pneumonia worsened over a period of 9 days. On the morning of the 10th day, Morella sent for Eli. Eli came at once. He brought his small son Daniel with him. The boy was 8 years old. Eli himself was 35 now, with the broad shoulders and weathered hands of a man who had spent 15 years building shelters that kept other people's children alive. Astrid was in the small back bedroom of Morella's house. She was sitting up against 3 pillows. Bear had died in 1894, and the dog she had now was a younger Pyrenean named Rolf, who was lying on the bed beside her. Her breath was shallow, but her mind was clear. She asked Morella to bring her the wooden box. Morella brought it. She set it on the bed beside Astrid. Astrid opened the box. The leather shoe with the brass buckle was inside. She lifted it out. She held it in her hand for a long, quiet moment. She looked at it the way she had looked at it on 1,000 evenings beside 1,000 small fires across 30 years. She held the shoe out to Eli. "This belonged to my son," she said. "His name was Henrik. He died when he was 4 years old in Minnesota on a night a great deal like the night you came to my door. I have carried this shoe for 30 years. I would like you to take it. I would like you to give it to Daniel if you think he is old enough to understand, or to keep it for him if you think he is not. I do not need it anymore." Eli took the shoe. He held it in both hands. He looked at his mother. Morella was crying quietly in the doorway. Eli did not understand the full meaning of what he was being given. He had not been told the story of Henrik. Morella had never told him. Morella had been told the story by Astrid in December of 1883 in the underground quarters beside the cast iron stove, and Morella had kept the story for 26 years because Astrid had asked her to. "I will keep it for him," Eli said. "I will give it to him when he is older." He paused. "Why?" he asked. Why are you giving me this?" Astrid looked at him for a long moment. "Because you lived," she said. She closed her eyes. She died at 11:17 that night. Morella held her hand. Rolf lay across her feet. Outside, the first snow of the season was falling in soft, thick flakes against the windows of the small house on the 2nd Street west of the Methodist Church in Lewistown. She was buried in the Lewistown Cemetery in a plot Thaddeus Holloway had purchased for her in 1898 on a small rise that faced south toward the Judith Mountains. Her marker was a piece of granite from Big Spring Creek, cut and polished by Owen Croft with 3 lines of text carved into its face. Astrid Bergstrom, 1850 to 1909. She built into the earth, and the earth held her. Morella Whitfield came to the grave once a week for the next 4 years, until her own health failed and she could no longer walk the 4 blocks to the cemetery. In the summer of 1917, on a warm July afternoon, a young man named Daniel Whitfield walked up the small rise to Astrid Bergstrom's grave. He was 16 years old. He carried a small object in his right hand. His father, Eli, had given him the object that morning on his 16th birthday, along with a story Eli had been waiting 8 years to tell. Daniel knelt beside the granite marker. He set the small leather shoe with the brass buckle on the top of the stone. He did not understand the full weight of what he was placing there. He understood from his father's story that the shoe had belonged to a small boy who had died long ago in Minnesota in another century, and that Astrid Bergstrom had carried it for 30 years, and that on a night his father had nearly died as a child, the shoe had been part of what had kept him alive. He sat beside the grave for a long time. The afternoon sun moved across the stone. His father had told him this morning, "Your life and my life and our family's life all depend on a woman who lost her own son and chose every single day for 30 years to use that loss to keep other people's sons alive. You will not understand what that means yet. I did not understand it when I was 16. I understood it when I held my own son for the first time and counted his fingers and thought about Astrid in the underground quarters, and I will tell you the rest of it when you are old enough to be a father." Daniel placed both his hands flat on the granite marker. He sat there until the sun began to set. Astrid Bergstrom died in the autumn of 1909. The newspaper obituary in the Lewistown Democrat News called her a quiet woman of practical wisdom whose construction methods had benefited families across the territory. The obituary did not mention the names of the 5 people who had survived in her quarters during the storm of 1884. It did not mention the lullaby she had sung to a 17-year-old girl on the 4th night of an illness. It did not mention the 47 gold coins, or the brown wool scarf, or the leather shoe with the brass buckle. The obituary did not need to mention these things. The structures she taught a territory to build kept saving lives long after her own life ended. The pamphlet, first printed in 1887, was reprinted with revisions in 1904, 1921, and 1946. Engineers from the University of Minnesota built a research cabin to her specifications in 1967 and used it to validate her temperature observations across 4 winters. The original underground quarters she had cut into a Montana hillside in the autumn of 1882, and the winter of 1883 were maintained by the Halverson family, and then by the Halverson family's daughter, and then by the daughter's grandson, and they were still standing in 2024 on a rise above Big Spring Creek, 6 miles south of Lewistown, with a small bronze plaque mounted beside the south-facing door that read in raised letters that the wind had not yet worn away. In this place in January of 1884, 5 people survived a blizzard that killed 38 others. The woman who built this shelter built it to honor a son she had lost. She lived to teach a territory how to live with its winters instead of against them. Her name was Astrid Bergstrom. She built into the earth, and the earth held her. That is the legacy, not the headlines, not the obituary, not even the structures themselves, although the structures matter and continue to matter. The legacy is the boy who placed a leather shoe on a granite marker on a July afternoon in 1917 and who lived to be 84 years old, dying in 1985 in a small town in Montana, not far from where his great-grandfather Eric Bergstrom had hammered a brass buckle into a leather shoe 106 years before. Daniel Whitfield taught his own son, and his son taught his son's son, that some debts are paid forward and never paid back, and that the woman who pulled 5 people through the door of an underground room in the worst winter the Montana Territory ever saw did so because she had buried her own son in Minnesota and had chosen with every breath she took for the rest of her life to use that grief to keep other people's children alive. She did not become wealthy. She did not become famous. She did not even, in the official sense, become important. She simply built a place where the cold could not reach the people inside it. She did this with her own hands in her own time on a hillside that nobody else had wanted against a banker who had decided she did not belong there, while carrying in a small wooden box the only piece of evidence that her son had ever existed. She is buried in the Lewistown Cemetery on a small rise that faces south toward the Judith Mountains, the same mountains the wind came down from on the night of January 23rd, 1884. Her grave faces south because she asked it to. The wind does not reach her now. The shoe is still on her stone. Replaced when the leather wore through by Daniel, then by Daniel's son, then by his grandson, each one a small act of remembering, each one a small refusal to let her be forgotten. It will be there as long as there are Whitfields in Montana to put it back, which means it will be there for a very long time. Astrid Bergstrom built into the earth, and the earth held her. It always will.